Glad to be here in Manchester, which used to be part of the industrial belt of Britain. My organisation, the Campaign Against Eurofederalism, known as CAFE, was founded in 1992 to address the labour and trade union movement and win that movement back to the anti-EU position it held from the 1960s until 1988. This is the year when Jacques Delors, the previous president of the European Commission, sold the myth of social Europe to the trade union movements in Denmark, Ireland and Britain in exchange for support for European Union. This was in the run-up to the Maastricht Treaty, single market and single currency. The labour movement has organisations which represent in one way or another the aspirations of the vast majority of the population, which is working class. CAFE's position stands firmly on the right of nation states to self-determination, national independence and democracy. We have made clear that the EU is the antithesis of democracy. It is a superstate government governed by EU institutions. We need to make clear that there is the continent of Europe and the European Union, not just Europe. It's a misnomer. The Commission is unelected, unaccountable, meets in secret and is the executive and legislature of the EU. Although the European Parliament, and with great respect to MPs either here or not here, is presented as the EU's democratic front. It can't raise taxes, an army, a police force, and can't legislate, but can temporarily block or suggest amendments to the Commission's legislation in what is politely called co-decision. The Council of Ministers and EU summits, one in a couple of weeks' time, meet in secret and use a qualified majority voting system. In QMV, Britain only has 12.6% of the votes and has to gain support from 15 other member states, which, with Britain, must represent 55% of the EU population to win the vote. Incidentally, Ireland, for instance, has 0.9%, and tiny Malta has 0.08%, no power at all. QMV shifted power away from smaller populated member states to the largest. In contrast, the UN General Assembly and other international bodies have one vote for each nation state. The European Court of Justice consists of 28 judges and overrides national courts and parliaments. Judgments by the ECJ cannot be appealed against. Only member states can take cases to the ECJ. Some judgments have come out against collective bargaining and for the free movement of labour, and even against striking. Now, if you can't strike, you're a slave. There are other EU institutions, some are not well known. For instance, COREPER is a committee of permanent ambassadors from EU member states. This committee prepares the agenda for the Council of Ministers and decides beforehand what can be rubber-stamped and what has to be discussed. There is even a European rail agency in Lille, where legislation for rail privatisation and other rail packages are prepared and passed to the Commission and national governments to put in place. Directive 91/440, about the only number I can remember, was used to privatise the railways. there was a directive to privatise the postal services, and so on. EU laws and legislation were changed from an intergovernmental system to a superstate and a union by the Lisbon Treaty or European Constitution. If you remember, the Dutch and the French chucked this out, but they rewrote it. In Britain, we have never had the opportunity to discuss this treaty before it was ratified. If we want to leave the EU, it is the Lisbon Treaty which must be discussed and published by the government, and not the charade of the trivial reforms now on the table in Brussels with red and yellow cards as though it were a game of football. We must show the red card to Cameron and get him off the pitch with a massive leave vote in the referendum. The Commissioner for Trade is negotiating undemocratically the secret Transatlantic Trade and Investment Treaty, TTIP, with her counterpart in Washington. TTIP and the Interstate Dispute Settlement alongside it overarch the EU with the object of bolting together the EU and US markets with poorer regulations on food, labour, conditions and wages and a lot more. The claws are out to grab and privatise the NHS for the largest lobby group in the US, the health and pharmaceutical companies. TTIP and ISDS override national parliaments and national democracy. There is a growing movement across the EU against TTIP and the ISDS settlement. 250,000 demonstrated recently in Berlin against TTIP. A petition of over 3 million was presented to the European Parliament, and they don't know quite what to do with this. The TUC and most trade unions oppose TTIP. Although there is all this opposition to TTIP and ISDS, the same institutions support the EU, which is a complete contradiction. You can't be both against TTIP and for the EU. Democracy only works within nation states, not between them. There is no democracy between Britain and Greece, for instance, or any other member state. The EU cannot be democratic despite the years of talk about putting right the democratic deficit. The way the EU operates is to take away the powers of national governments and at the same time cull national democracy. To date, the world is run with nation states having the right to self-determination and national democracy. There are more nation states today than 10 or 20 years ago, with the prospect of more coming into being. The nation state is here to stay and is not a 19th century anachronism. Those who want to end nation states and national democracy are those forces behind TTIP, ISDS and the EU. Britain, as a nation state to function to the benefit of the peoples of Britain, must have control of its own borders, must be able to control its fisheries, must be able to protect the industries and jobs involved. We must be able to decide who comes into the country. That means we'll be able to bring to an end the free movement of labour in order to protect wages and conditions, which is of growing Further, the free movement of labour is not immigration. I'll state that again. Further, the free movement of labour is not immigration. They're two separate subjects. Since the 1975 referendum, the deindustrialisation of Britain is all but complete. If you remember, we had a coal industry, which I worked in, a steel industry, shipbuilding and manufacturing, which I worked in. We traded across the world. These industries were the backbone of the economy, which created wealth to pay for all the public services, such as the NHS, education, and the welfare state. Today, there are 1,680,000 people currently out of work, and many of those are young people with their lives blighted. We have soup kitchens and food banks. The alternative to EU membership is to have an economy based on manufacturing, associated industries, and to trade across the world, including nation states in the EU, instead of an economy based on the financial, banking and service sectors, which has got into deep water in addition to being locked into a crumbling, crisis-ridden EU. Thank goodness we did not join the euro. For example, for jobs, the nation-states of Africa need electrification. So does India and Pakistan. We should be making some of this equipment and a lot more besides. We will need a merchant navy to carry the goods and a shipbuilding industry again to make these ships. You can help work out a rational future for Britain and its people yourselves, and I hope you discuss this. CAFE makes the strong case that the only way to oppose TTIP, ISDS and EU legislation from Brussels and the free movement of everything is to repeal the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty. This is to show a big red card to Cameron in a massive vote to leave the EU. I wish you all well in our joint efforts to extricate Britain from the EU. Thanks for listening.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.